Russia is slowly losing Siberia to China, and most people don't even realize it's happening. Not through military invasion or dramatic conquest, but through demographics, economics, and geographic inevitability that could transfer the world's largest territory to Chinese control within decades. Siberia contains $30 trillion worth of natural resources, 20% of global fresh water, and enough oil and gas to power civilization for centuries. Here's how China could gain control of this massive territory without firing a single shot, and why Russia might be powerless to stop it. This isn't speculation, it's already happening through population movements, economic integration, and infrastructure development that's making Siberia more Chinese than Russian. The numbers tell the story. 6 million Russians live east of the Urals compared to 120 million Chinese within 100 miles of the Russian border. Chinese companies control major Siberian resource extraction projects. Chinese workers are building Russian infrastructure. The demographic and economic takeover of Siberia represents the largest peaceful territorial transfer in modern history. Siberia spans 13.1 million square kilometers, larger than the United States and Europe combined. This vast territory contains 25% of the world's timber, 20% of global gold reserves, 30% of global diamond production, and massive deposits of coal, iron ore, copper, and rare earth elements essential for modern technology. The region holds Russia's largest oil and gas fields, providing 60% of Russian energy exports that fund the entire Russian economy. But here's the critical vulnerability: virtually no Russians actually live there. Siberia's population density is just 0.3 people per square kilometer compared to 146 people per square kilometer in European Russia. Most Siberian cities were built during Soviet industrialization programs that artificially moved populations eastward through government incentives and forced relocations. When those programs ended, people left. The Trans-Siberian Railway, Russia's lifeline to its eastern territories, represents both connection and vulnerability. This single rail line, built over a century ago, remains the primary link between European Russia and Siberian resources. The railway spans 9,289 kilometers, making it the world's longest railroad but also its most fragile strategic asset. Any disruption to this line cuts European Russia off from 77% of its territory. China's demographic advantage creates inexorable pressure on sparsely populated Russian lands. Northeast China, bordering Siberia, contains 120 million people living in declining industrial cities with limited economic opportunities. These populations view Siberian resources and empty lands as natural expansion areas for Chinese agriculture, mining, and settlement. Chinese economic penetration of Siberia accelerated dramatically after Western sanctions pushed Russia toward Asian partnerships. China became Russia's largest trading partner, financing major Siberian development projects that Russia cannot afford independently. The Power of Siberia pipeline, costing $55 billion, delivers Russian gas to China while creating permanent Chinese economic influence over Russian energy infrastructure. Chinese companies now control significant portions of Siberian resource extraction. China National Petroleum Corporation operates major Siberian oil fields. Chinese mining companies extract Siberian gold, copper, and rare earth elements. Chinese agricultural companies lease millions of hectares of Siberian farmland. Each investment deepens Chinese integration into Siberian economics while reducing Russian control over their own territory. The demographic trends are accelerating in China's favor. Russia's population east of the Urals declined 15% since 1990 and continues falling as young Russians migrate to Moscow and St. Petersburg for economic opportunities. Meanwhile, Chinese migration into Siberia increases annually through legal work programs, agricultural leases, and business investments that require Chinese management and technical expertise. Climate change amplifies these dynamics by making Siberian resources more accessible and valuable. Global warming opens Arctic shipping routes that bypass European Russia entirely, connecting Siberian ports directly to Chinese markets. Thawing permafrost reveals new mineral deposits while making agriculture possible in previously frozen territories. Climate change essentially increases Siberian value while reducing Russian ability to control access. Russia's military presence in Siberia remains surprisingly limited despite the region's strategic importance. Most Russian military assets concentrate in the European region facing NATO threats. Eastern military district forces are spread across enormous distances with limited transportation infrastructure. In any crisis, Russia would struggle to reinforce Siberian positions against local challenges to authority. Here's something most analysts miss about this situation. Tell me in the comments. Do you think China would actually want to formally annex Siberia, or would indirect economic control serve Chinese interests better? Consider that direct annexation would trigger massive international response while economic domination achieves the same resource access without the diplomatic costs. What's your take on China's real strategy here? Share your thoughts below. These discussions help me understand which aspects of geopolitical strategy you find most interesting. The Belt and Road Initiative creates infrastructure dependencies that gradually transfer control from Russian to Chinese authority. Chinese companies build roads, railways, ports, and communication networks throughout Siberia using Chinese workers, Chinese materials, and Chinese technical standards. This infrastructure serves Chinese economic interests first, Russian national interests second. Chinese investment in Siberian cities creates economic relationships that override political boundaries. Chinese companies provide employment, Chinese banks provide credit, Chinese markets provide demand for local products. Russian authorities become dependent on Chinese economic activity to maintain basic government services in sparsely populated regions. Language and cultural penetration follow economic integration. Chinese language study increases in Siberian schools. Chinese cultural centers open in major Siberian cities. Chinese media broadcasts reach Russian populations. Chinese business practices become standard in joint ventures. Cultural influence creates psychological preparation for eventual political integration. The precedent exists for peaceful territorial transfers through demographic and economic pressure. Hong Kong returned to Chinese control through economic integration rather than military conquest. Tibet was incorporated through demographic flooding and economic development. Similar patterns appear throughout Chinese history where patient economic and demographic pressure achieves territorial goals that military action cannot. Russia's responses to Chinese penetration remain limited and ineffective. Attempts to encourage Russian migration to Siberia through government incentives have failed consistently. Russian infrastructure development cannot match Chinese investment levels. Russian companies lack capital to compete with Chinese resource extraction capabilities. Moscow's policy tools are inadequate for addressing demographic and economic realities. The strategic implications extend far beyond Russian territorial integrity. Chinese control of Siberian resources would create the world's largest economic power, combining China's manufacturing capacity with Russia's resource wealth. This consolidation would fundamentally alter global resource markets, energy supplies, and strategic materials availability. A Chinese Siberia would control global supplies of critical minerals essential for renewable energy technology, electronics manufacturing, and military systems. Combined Chinese Siberian territory would span from the Pacific Ocean to Central Asia, creating the world's largest continental empire. This geographic dominance would enable Chinese control over Asian trade routes and energy supplies. The timeline for this transition accelerates with each economic crisis that forces Russia toward greater Chinese dependence. War in Ukraine deepened Russian reliance on Chinese markets for energy exports. Western sanctions eliminated alternative partnerships, making China Russia's only major economic partner. Each crisis strengthens Chinese bargaining position while weakening Russian autonomy. Environmental factors create additional pressure for territorial reorganization. Siberian forests represent crucial carbon sinks requiring massive investment for preservation and management. Russian government lacks resources for environmental protection while Chinese companies have both capital and technology for sustainable resource development. Environmental necessity may justify Chinese management of Siberian territories. The nuclear factor complicates but doesn't prevent territorial transfer scenarios. Russia's nuclear weapons provide security against direct military attack, but are useless against demographic replacement and economic integration. Nuclear powers have lost territory throughout history when demographic and economic factors override military advantages. Nuclear weapons cannot stop population decline or economic dependence. International law provides minimal protection against gradual territorial shifts achieved through economic and demographic means. Chinese acquisition of Siberian territory through legal investment, migration, and resource development would be difficult to challenge legally. Peaceful territorial changes based on economic integration have historical precedent and international legitimacy. The inevitability of this process stems from fundamental asymmetries between Chinese and Russian capabilities. China has surplus population, excess capital, technological expertise, and growing resource demands. Russia has surplus territory, declining population, limited capital, and inability to develop resources independently. These complementary needs create natural integration pressures. Resistance strategies available to Russia include population incentives, infrastructure development, military buildup, and diplomatic alternatives to Chinese partnership. However, each strategy requires resources and capabilities Russia currently lacks. Economic sanctions, demographic decline, and technological limitations constrain Russian options for maintaining Siberian control. The global consequences of Chinese Siberian control would reshape international relations fundamentally. Combined Chinese Siberian territory would control the world's largest landmass, resource reserves, and freshwater supplies. This consolidation could enable Chinese dominance over global resources markets and strategic materials essential for modern technology. Alternative scenarios include continued Russian control through successful demographic programs, international intervention to prevent Chinese expansion, or partition arrangements that divide Siberian territory between multiple powers. However, current trends favor gradual Chinese integration regardless of formal political arrangements. Understanding this territorial shift explains Chinese long-term strategy and Russian strategic vulnerabilities. China's patient approach to territorial expansion through economic integration represents a new model for peaceful conquest that other powers may emulate. Russia's Siberian losses demonstrate how demographic decline and economic dependence can override military capabilities in territorial control. The transformation of Siberia from Russian to Chinese sphere of influence represents one of the most significant geopolitical changes of the 21st century. This shift occurs gradually through economic integration rather than dramatic military action, making it less visible but potentially more permanent than traditional conquest. What do you think represents the most significant factor in this potential territorial shift: demographic decline, economic dependence, or geographic inevitability? Are there historical precedents that suggest how this process might unfold, or is this a completely new form of territorial expansion? Drop your analysis in the comments and let me know what other gradual geopolitical shifts you think deserve attention. Subscribe for more deep dives into the slow-motion changes reshaping our world, because the most important transformations often happen too gradually to notice until they're irreversible. Thanks for watching.